Hey guys, my name is Austin, and in this course I'm going to be teaching you how to create an inventory system in Unity. We're going to start from scratch using a couple of free assets for the UI elements, some panels and some item icons, and we're going to write all the code ourselves. So we're going to get started really fast. I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to call it Inventory Zenva, and I'm going to select 2D. Now this is not related to the inventory itself, more so to your game, but in my case it's going to be 2D, and I don't need the analytics enabled for this. And I'm going to create project. Alright, so in Unity I have the default layout set. You can change this in window layouts and you can change it however you'd like, but I'm going with the default so we're all on the same page. And the first thing I want to do is, in this episode we're going to actually set up the item and the item database. But the first thing I want to do is set up a folder structure to work with. So I'm going to right click in my assets folder, go to create and create a folder. I'm going to call this scripts. Now this folder is going to contain all of my scripts. That's going to be from all my inventory stuff, the UI stuff, all of that's going to be in this folder. Then I want a folder that's going to be called resources. Now this is a special folder in Unity that's going to allow me to load data from this folder from code. So I can actually load the sprites in that are stored in this folder while I'm writing my code out. That's pretty easy to do. So we're going to use that for that. Now inside of resources, I want to create another folder. It's going to be called sprites. And then maybe inside of sprites, I would have something like items, right? And then just have my item icons inside of that. And your structure can be however you would like, but this is how I'm going to do mine. And then inside of scripts, I have all my script files for my project. So what I want to do first is I want to go ahead and grab my images and bring them in. So we have them all in. Go ahead and set the sprites up to work how we want them to work. Now, as I said, we're using some free assets. As you can see here, these are available for you to get. These are going to be the actual UI, and then we have the item icons here. So I'm going to grab all of these. I'm going to drag them into Unity, just like this, and just drop them in my into my sprites folder. And then while in sprites, I want to grab them again just by click there and hold down shift and select over here. And I want to drag them into items. Now inside of items, I want to select all of them by hitting Control A. And I'm going to go up here and make sure they're set to be Sprite, 2D, and UI. All of them should be selected as that because we're going to be using these, all of these are going to be used in the UI. And now these UI elements here, these are going to be scalable, right? So they're not going to be squares or however they're set up currently. I'm going to actually be able to stretch them out any way I want to. And then the actual tooltip panel is going to have to expand to fit the content of the tooltip, and that'll make sense later on. So to do this, we're going to set up something that's called 9 slicing on these sprites. So if I select this button right here and actually go up here to the sprite editor, you'll see this right here. Now this is a zoomed in version of the sprite, but you see these little green anchors on the sides. What I want to do is add a border around this sprite so that whenever the sprite is stretched out, it doesn't actually stretch the pixels. It'll just tile the border, and then the contents inside of the border will be tiled as well. So you don't get any of those stretching artifacts, and you don't get all blurry and look terrible. So what I'm going to do is do a border on the left side, maybe something like 10, 7 or so on the sides and the top, just like that. And now on the bottom you have that bit of a shadow. So it'd be something more, looks like 12. And now the regions on the sides are the ones that are going to tile as it stretches. This is going to tile horizontally, and these are going to tile vertically. And then this in the middle here is going to tile both ways because there's no telling how it's going to be stretched. So with that like that, I'm going to apply my changes. And I'm going to do the same thing to these other panels. Okay, great. So now let's decide what our items are going to actually be. Because in a game, you think of an item, it can be anything, right? It can be a cup, it can be a sword, it can be a scroll that does something, a potion that does something, all these things. But we need to actually decide what they all share, what they all have in common. And in our case, it's going to be something along the lines of they're going to all have a name, they're going to all have a description, they're going to all have some kind of stats, they're going to all have an ID, stuff like that, right? So we're going to decide what the actual data is required for each item, and we're going to set up a blueprint in a sense to define our items in the future. So let's go ahead and do that really fast. In my scripts folder, I'm going to right click, go to create. I'm going to create a C# script. We're going to be using C# throughout all of this. And I'm going to call this item. Now item, the script file is going to contain an item class. And the class is a way, it's a blueprint. In our case, the way we're going to be using the constructor, which we'll get to in a second, it's a blueprint for designing items. So if you're thinking of it as in a building, you have a blueprint to design a building, and your architect designs the blueprint, and you pass it on to your construction workers that are going to actually build the item based on the blueprint. What we're going to be designing is the blueprint, and then later on, the other parts of the game, they're going to be the construction workers, and they're going to build the items based on the blueprint for us. And that'll all make sense later on, but that's just to give you a bit of a basis of what we're going to be trying to do. So I'm going to open this up in Visual Studio, and by default, your script file will look like this. And for now, we're going to go ahead and get rid of all of this stuff inside of our class, because we don't want anything predefined for us. We're going to work with it all ourselves. And also, this one doesn't necessarily have to be a mono behavior. I'm not going to necessarily explain what that is, but we don't need it for this instance. So we have a class that's public called item. Cool, so now we can define the values that item needs. As we were saying before, it's more like a building blueprint that then can be used later on to build the building. So we're going to decide what all the measurements are and where the things should be placed and what they should be called. Later on when we build the building, we will use all those measurements to handle constructing the actual building. So we're going to be needing a public string, public allowing us to access it outside of this object, outside of item itself, and a string, just a string of text. And I'm going to call this item, or we could do something like title. Item title, the name of the item. Then I want to have a string that's going to be the description of the item. The same thing, just a description. It's going to be a longer form of text. It's going to describe what the item is. And then we'll have an ID. So it's going to be an integer. That's an ID. Integer just being a number without any decimal points. And I'm going to add this to the top actually. So I'm just going to put my ID up there. And we're also going to need to be able to define an icon for the item. The actual image is going to represent the item in the inventory. And each item is going to have its own icon. So it's going to be just something we define within our item like this. So it's going to be a public. It's going to be a sprite, which is just those images that we drug into the Unity assets folder. And then we're going to call it icon. And the last thing we're going to need is a list of stats, or more specifically, a dictionary of stats. And the way a dictionary works, if you're not familiar, is I can have a whole list of items in my dictionary, and they all have their own values, but the way I find those items in the dictionary is as I look for the key. So think about it like I have item of sword, and it brings up the sword item, right? So sword item is the actual item in the dictionary, and sword is the key that I use to find that item. So in our case, we're going to have it set up with stats. So it'd be something like power, and that brings up the power stat. So it gives us the actual value of the power stat. So maybe it'll be 15 or 16. So if I search for power in the dictionary, it'll give me the value of 16. And that's what we want. So we're going to have a dictionary of stats. So to define that, we're going to be using the generic namespace of the collections in system. And that's by default defined for us. So I'm going to do a public. It's going to be a dictionary. And now this is going to be looking for a type. So we can pass the type into these two little brackets right here, these little angle brackets. And the type that we're going to be using, it's defining the key value pair. So the key being the stat name and the value being the actual stat level, right? So it's going to be a string and then an integer. So the key we use to search for the dictionary, and the value that we get back is going to be the level itself. And I'm going to call this stats. And then we're going to initialize the dictionary. Now this is how you initialize anything in C#. I'm using the constructor for new dictionary, and I'm just passing it the same types. And then you have the two parentheses that defines that this is a constructor. I am invoking it. And that'll make more sense here in a second whenever we define our own constructor. So we have this blueprint now for what our items should be. Now we need to decide how we're going to create these items. And the way we're going to do that first of all is we're going to use a constructor. A constructor is going to take values from somewhere else, and it's going to apply those values to this instance of item. So if I wanted to take and do a public item, and what we have here is, notice it's item, which is the exact same thing that our class is called, and it's public. There's no type, because if we do it by the name of the class, it doesn't require a type. It's by default a constructor for the class. And this is going to take some parameters. The first one being an int of ID. Notice that we have an int of ID, and we're going to just follow down the list. We're going to do a string of title and a string for description, then a sprite icon, and then a stats as a dictionary. Just like that. So now we're going to use this whenever we build the item. We're going to reference this from somewhere else in our game, and we're going to pass these values as the parameters, and then we're going to build the item in here. So the way we do that is I say this.id is equal to ID. Now what's happening here is I'm saying this, which is referring to this instance of items. So we're going to have multiple items, right? So when I build an item, the only way to get the exact instance of that item whenever we're referring to that item is by saying this item. Because we're going to have a bunch of items, and whenever we construct an item, we want to make sure that we know what item we're talking about. This ID and not this ID, right? This is the object instance members, the variables that are on the object instance, and these are local to the constructor. So this.id is equal to ID, this.title is equal to title. So this ID is here, and this ID is here. We're just assigning the values from the constructor to the actual item values. But when it gets to icon, we have to do it a bit differently, because what I actually don't want to do is I don't want to pass in an icon, because we aren't going to know what icon we're looking for when we construct it. What would be ideal is if maybe, without doing that, we grab the icon based on the title of the item. So I could do something like this.icon, which is a sprite, is equal to, and now this is where we go through the resources folder to grab the icon. So to do that, we go through a resources class, just like that. It's going to light up green for you. And you're going to go to something called load. And for load, you're going to tell it where the item you're loading is and what the item is called. Now, resources limits you to the resources folder in your game. So by default, it's already in resources, right? So if we look at this and we go in resources, it starts off here. So then we have to tell it, hey, go to sprites and then go to items. And then now here are our items that we want. That's cool. So let's go ahead and do that really fast. So we start off in the resources folder, and then we go to sprites, and then we go to items, and then we have the items in there. So what I want to do is, once we get to that directory, I want to look for an item by the name of the item name that we're building. So it's going to be something along the lines of concatenating title, which just adds to the end of that title. And that's going to tell me that we have an issue, because what I'm doing is I'm loading in a generic type, and it's going to be an object. It's going to be an object type, which is a base type for all things. So I'm trying to convert it to an actual sprite. And it's like, I don't know what you're trying to do. You're not telling me what you're trying to do. So one way I can do this is I can do the type like we did for the dictionary and just say, hey, I am looking for a sprite. And now it knows, okay, the item that I'm finding in resources is in fact a sprite. But you may be thinking that, oh, these item names in Unity are not how I'm going to name my items, right? So it's going to be up to you how you do this, but I'm just going to rename these. This can be diamond sword, just like that. And this can be silver pick. And this can be diamond pick, and so on. Just like that. And the last thing we want to do is grab the stats and assign it to the stats that we pass through the constructor. Pretty cool, but I want to make one more constructor. This one's done. That's going to allow me to copy an item. And we'll use this later on, and I'll explain it later on. But what we're going to be doing is taking in an item, just like that. So we're saying that we're going to take in a type that is already item. It's already an item. And then I'm going to grab the values from that. And we're doing what's called a copy constructor. And this is going to allow us to actually take the values from the item that we passed in and assign it to this item. That way, if we have an item that we want to duplicate, which we will, all we have to do is pass it to our item constructor and it will create a copy for us. Cool. And the next thing for this episode is we want to actually define the item database, which is going to be a way to set up all of the items in our game using this information. So now in our scripts folder, I'm going to create a new C# script, and it's going to be called item database. Go ahead and open that up. Now item database is going to have all of the items in our game defined in a list, and then it's going to have a couple of methods for looking up items and getting items that we're looking for. So from our player, it would say I want to add the item of the diamond sword. Well, I'm going to go to the item database and look for the diamond sword and pull that out and then add it to the player. So to do that, first of all, we need to have an item database. So I'm going to create a method. It's going to return nothing. It's going to be a void. And I'm going to call it build database. And this is going to handle constructing all of the items in our game. And we're going to be adding them to a list, which again is going through the collections.generic namespace. It's going to be a public list of item. Know how it was a dictionary before? Same thing, except a list is just a single column. A dictionary is 2 columns. So we have just item, the item type. Then we'll call it items, and then we're going to construct it the same way we did before. Pass in item. Notice item is the type that we just made over here. So it's going to have all these properties available to it, as well as these constructors available to it for each item in our item list. Pretty cool. So to handle that, what I can do is in build database, I can say items.add, and we can add the items this way by doing a new item and all that, or we can do it by saying items is equal to a new list of item. Notice we're constructing it the same way we do here, except now we can define some default values for it by doing this right here. So anything inside of these curly braces will be added to the item list. So we're going to do new item. Now notice we're doing a new and then the item type with the curly braces as we did for the constructors. And this is going to create a new instance of item using our blueprint. So this is us building the building now. We have the blueprint for the building, and now we're going to take all the data and use it to build the building. So with item, notice it's telling me what I need. I need an integer for the ID, so it's going to be 0. Then I need a string for the title, so I'm going to call this one diamond sword. Needs a description. Well, a sword made of diamond. Seems to fit. And then it needs a list or a dictionary for the stats. And now this is where it gets fun. So I'm going to create a new dictionary, just like we did in the item, for a string and then an integer. And then the same way we're doing the list here that we're defining what gets added to that, I'm going to do the same thing for the dictionary. So first of all, I'm going to bring this down to a new line. Then I'm going to add the curly braces like we did for our item. And in fact, I don't need these parentheses for this. And I can also get rid of this semicolon here. So now we're defining a new dictionary that's going to be string on the left side and integer on the right. So string for the key and integer for the value. So to do that, we're going to add another parenthesis or another curly braces block here. And inside of this, we're going to just define our stats. So it's going to be power, for instance, and then the power level is 15. Okay, so now we have a key value pair stored in that dictionary, and it's going to pass it to the item. And I can add another one with a comma here. I'm going to call this one defense, for instance, and give it a defense of 10. And you can add as many as you want per dictionary, and they don't have to match. They can be different. They can be whatever you want them to be. So I'm going to take this route and create a couple of different items for testing. And as you can see here, I'm separating the new items with a comma the same way we do in the dictionary for the new stats. And I'm incrementing the ID by 1 for each one because we're going to have a unique ID per item. And I created the diamond ore with a value of 300. And now I have a silver pick with the ID of 2 with a description, a power, and a mining level. Notice that my names are matching the names that I set up for my sprites, because that's how we grab the icons. And that's going to be all the items that I create. Please get creative with this, make as many as you want, and make them do whatever you want. And the last thing we need for this episode is a way to find items in the database. So first of all, I have to construct the actual database. So I'm going to do on awake. Now awake is the first thing that happens in your game and happens before the start method is invoked. So you can do all of your initialization here. And I'm just going to do a build database. Just like that. It's going to call that method and do all this for us. So now items is going to be equal to all these items. Cool. So now I want to set up a couple of ways to query the database. So I'm going to do a public. These are going to return items. So it can return a type of item. I'm going to call it get item. And we can get item by the item ID. So an integer called ID. And the way we're going to handle this is we're going to loop through the list and look for something that matches the item ID that we're looking for. So if we're looking for item ID of 1, it's going to loop through the list until it finds an item ID of 1 and then return that item out to whatever called it. So for this, we're going to go through the items list and we're going to use something called find. This allows us to define what's called a lambda expression to look for something specific in this item list. So simply the way this works is on the left side of the lambda operator, I'll show you in a second, you have the name of the parameter. Then on the right side, you have your expression. And what I'm going to be doing with this is I can call this, we can call it item. And then that's going to be on the left side of what is called the lambda expression or the lambda operator. Then on the right side, you have your expression. So this is going to say item goes to this side, and item is going to contain whatever item we're currently looped over in our find method. So if we did a simple for loop, you're going to be using an integer to determine your key. In a sense, this is your key. Then I'm going to check to see if item, this one right here, which is the item that we're currently looped over, if the ID is equal to the ID that we're looking for, just like that. So I'm going to take the ID, compare it to all the item IDs in this item list, and we're going to look to see if we can find one that matches the ID that we're looking for. So if we do, I want to make sure I return that one. So for instance, if I did it right here and I said get item of 2, now this will give me the access to item ID with 2. So I could say, hey, what's the item title? Just like that. And I could log that out or use that somewhere. But in this case, we're just getting the framework set up for the rest of the system to use. And I'm going to copy this. And I want to use something similar, but we're going to be looking for it by name. Now the way this works is this is called an overload. Notice that the names are the same, but the parameters are different. So whenever you're looking for it, you'll have two options for get item. You can pass it either an integer or you can pass it a string. And the string version is going to do the same thing, except it's going to compare the item title instead of the item ID. So if it finds one that matches the name that you're looking for, it'll do the same thing. The exact same thing. Very simple. Notice how easy it is using the find method here, since we just added in a whole new parameter and we got it up and running in 2 seconds. That's going to be it for this episode. In the next episode, we're going to set up the actual inventory where we can have a list of items for our player and a way to add and remove and look for items to see if our player currently has an item. All kinds of cool things. We're going to be using the item database and the item class, as you can see that we've set up here. Again, guys, my name is Austin Gregory, and I will see you next time.